The morning Rebecca Keating walked into the Clearwater Land Office in Dodge City, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she walked in with every intention of walking out as the rightful owner of 160 acres of good Kansas earth, and she walked out instead with the sound of men's laughter ringing in her ears like a bell that would not stop. She had prepared for months. She had the paperwork. She had her late father's survey notes, his claim receipts, the original filing documents he had completed before the fever took him in December, and she had every legal right to stand before that counter and state her case. What she had not prepared for was the particular cruelty of small men behind large desks who saw a woman standing alone and decided, before she had spoken a single word, that she was not worth taking seriously. The land office sat on the main street of Dodge City, wedged between a hardware supply store and a tobacco shop. It was a squat, square building with a painted wooden sign above the door that read Clearwater Land and CLAIMS Office, the letters faded by 2 seasons of Kansas sun. Rebecca pushed open the door, and the little brass bell above the frame announced her arrival to 3 men who were seated at various positions around the cluttered interior. The man behind the main counter was named Gerald Whitmore. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the soft, doughy look of someone who had spent the last 20 of those years behind a desk, rather than on any land he had ever processed a deed for. He wore a brown vest and a pocket watch he checked with unnecessary frequency, as though the act of checking it communicated something important about his time being more valuable than anyone else's. The 2 men on either side of the room, seated at smaller writing desks, were younger clerks whose names Rebecca never learned, because neither of them ever addressed her directly. Rebecca stepped to the counter. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned carefully beneath a bonnet that had seen better days. Her dress was plain and practical, brown cotton with a mended hem, and she carried a leather satchel that her father had bought in St. Louis the year she was born. She was not a woman who had ever particularly cared whether or not people thought her beautiful, but she cared very deeply about being taken seriously, and she straightened her spine as she set the satchel on the counter and looked Gerald Whitmore in the eye. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Rebecca Keating. My father was Thomas Keating. He filed a homestead claim on parcel 47 in the southern section, adjoining the creek near the Wilson Fork, back in October of last year. He passed away in December before the claim was fully processed, and I am here to transfer and complete that filing in my own name under the Homestead Act." Gerald Whitmore looked at her. He looked at the satchel. He looked at her again. Then he looked at the clerk to his left, and he did something that Rebecca would remember for the rest of her life. He smiled, not the smile of a man who was pleased to assist someone, the smile of a man who had just been handed an opportunity to perform for an audience. "Miss Keating," he said, drawing her name out with the slow, savoring quality of a man who thought himself clever, "are you telling me you intend to file a homestead claim, you personally?" "Yes," she said, "that is precisely what I am telling you." "Well now," he said, and he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. "The Homestead Act does allow for women who are heads of household or who are citizens over 21. That is true enough. But what it does not provide for, in the particular situation you are describing, is the inheritance of an incomplete claim. Your father's paperwork, if he passed before the full processing was completed, would have reverted to available land." "That is not accurate," Rebecca said. She opened the satchel and placed the documents on the counter in a neat stack. "The Act allows for inheritance of a claim by immediate family in cases of death during the filing period. I have the original filing receipt dated October 14th, his survey notes, and a letter from our county judge in Larned County confirming his filing status at the time of his death. The 5-year residency requirement had not yet begun, so there was nothing to revert." Whitmore did not look at the documents. He looked at the clerk to his right this time, and there was the smile again, broader now, more comfortable in itself. "Miss Keating," he said, with the exaggerated patience of a schoolteacher addressing a particularly slow child. I think perhaps you have been misled about the nature of these matters. Land law is complicated business. Perhaps you ought to speak with your husband or a male relation who might better understand the legal particulars. I do not have a husband, Rebecca said. And I understand the legal particulars perfectly well. Well, he said, and he actually chuckled, a short and dismissive sound, and the clerk to his left let out a small snort, and the one to his right shook his head with a tired, indulgent expression. Be that as it may, I am afraid I am not in a position to process this today. You are welcome to return with proper representation. What representation? What is lacking in this documentation? Miss Keating. He stood up from his chair now, which was a gesture meant to end the conversation, to physically communicate that he was a large man behind a large counter, and she was a small woman who should know when a door was being closed in her face. I have other business to attend to. And that was when the laughter started in earnest, because the clerk to his left said, under his breath but not far enough under it, "Come back when you find yourself a husband who can read." And the other clerk laughed outright, a brash and ugly sound, and Whitmore allowed himself a slow, satisfied smile, and Rebecca Keating, who had not cried since the night her father died, felt something hot and sharp rise behind her eyes. She did not cry. She would not give them that. She gathered her documents with hands that were completely steady. She placed them back in the satchel with perfect care, and she walked out of the Clearwater Land office with her chin level, and her boots making clean, deliberate sounds on the plank flooring. She was on the wooden sidewalk outside when the laughter from within the office reached her through the closed door, muffled but unmistakable. 3 men, all of them laughing, and the sound of it followed her down the street like something she could not outpace. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and stood there for a moment, breathing the Dodge City air, which smelled of horses and dust and the distant sweetness of the stockyards. Her hands were shaking now, only slightly, but she pressed them flat against the sides of the satchel and made them be still. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the morning to grow brighter around her, for the street traffic to thicken with wagons and riders, for a dog to trot past with something unidentifiable in its mouth. Long enough to make a decision about what she was going to do next, which was to find someone with the authority to make those men inside that office do their jobs. She was still making that decision when a shadow fell beside her on the planking. Frederick Dawson had ridden into Dodge City that morning before sunrise, which was not unusual for him. He was the sort of man who was always somewhere before the sun, which was partly his nature and partly the profession of cattle ranching, which demanded an early start regardless of preference. He was 31 years old, tall in a way that was functional rather than showy, with the particular kind of leanness that comes from years of hard physical work rather than any intentional effort at appearance. His hair was dark and kept back under a wide-brimmed hat that had been through enough Kansas weather to have developed its own character. His face was angular and sun-weathered, and had, at some point in the past, been broken in the general area of the nose, which had healed at a slight angle that somehow suited the rest of him. He had come to Dodge City to settle a grazing dispute with a neighboring rancher, a matter of fences and water rights that had been festering for 2 months. He had not come to Dodge City to involve himself in anyone else's business. He was not, by nature, a man who inserted himself into the affairs of strangers. He was, however, a man who had been raised by a woman who had homesteaded 40 acres in Missouri on her own after his father died, and who had spent Rebecca Keating's entire childhood making certain her son understood the precise value of that kind of courage. He had just come out of the hardware store with a box of fence staples when he noticed the woman standing at the edge of the sidewalk in front of the land office. He noticed her because she was standing very still in the middle of a street full of movement, and because, even from a distance, there was something about the set of her shoulders that communicated something he recognized. A particular posture of a person who has just been treated badly and is deciding what to do about it. He set the fence staples in his saddlebag and walked over to her, not because he had decided to exactly, but because his feet carried him in that direction before his better judgment could weigh in on the subject. "Morning," he said. Rebecca turned and looked at him. He was a stranger. He was a large man in dusty trail clothes with a working cowboy's look about him, sun-dark and direct. She had no reason to speak to him, and several good reasons not to, which were the same reasons a woman alone in a western town in 1878 always had for being cautious about which conversation she entered. "Good morning," she said, politely but without warmth, the way a woman signals that she is not inviting continued conversation. He understood the signal. He had enough social sense to read it clearly. He also noticed that her jaw was set in a way that suggested she was working very hard at something internal, and that her eyes, which were a dark, clear gray, held an expression he could only describe as barely contained. "I do not mean to intrude," he said. "I just came out of the hardware store, and I happened to notice that you were outside the land office." He paused. "I also heard some laughter coming through that door a moment ago that did not sound like it was meant kindly." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. She had a way of looking at people that was very direct, as though she was conducting a rapid assessment and would not apologize for the thoroughness of it. "You are not wrong," she said. "Do you want to tell me what happened in there?" "Not particularly," she said, and then, because something in his manner was straightforward and without the performative quality she had just endured, she found herself saying, "My father filed a homestead claim before he died. I have every legal right to complete that filing in my own name." The man behind the counter decided he did not feel like doing his job today and dressed it up as a legal opinion, and his clerks found it amusing. Frederick was quiet for a moment. He looked at the door of the land office. He looked back at her. "Do you have your paperwork with you?" he asked. "I do." "Would you mind if I looked at it?" She raised one eyebrow slightly. "Are you a lawyer?" "No," he said. "I am a cattle rancher. But I have filed 2 homestead claims of my own, and I have read the Homestead Act more times than I would like to admit, because the last time I trusted someone else to read it for me, it cost me 6 months of grazing rights." He extended one hand. "Frederick Dawson. My spread is about 14 miles southeast of here." She looked at the hand. She shook it. "Rebecca Keating." She told him everything. She stood there on the wooden sidewalk in the morning sun of Dodge City, and she told him about her father's claim, about the filing receipt, about the letter from the county judge, about the 5-year residency provision and the inheritance allowance. And Frederick Dawson stood very still and listened to every word with the kind of attention that suggested he was actually processing what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he held out his hand, and she opened the satchel and gave him the documents, and he read them carefully, his eyes moving slowly across each page. When he looked up, his expression was clear and certain. "He was wrong," Frederick said. "Whitmore, every point you raised is accurate. The filing receipt establishes the date of your father's claim. The inheritance provision under the Act is explicit for immediate family. There is nothing in here that is incomplete or invalid." He handed the papers back to her. "That man in there is either ignorant of the law or he is choosing not to apply it." "I believe it is the latter," Rebecca said. "So do I," he said. Then he looked at the door of the land office again, and something settled in his expression. "Come back in with me." She looked at him. "I beg your pardon." "Come back in with me," he said again. "I will go back in there with you, and we will stand at that counter together, and we will not leave until this is settled." Rebecca looked at him for a long time. She was not a woman who accepted help easily. She had learned, through the particular education that life in the West gave to women alone, that offers of help from men were often something else dressed up in the clothes of generosity. She looked at Frederick Dawson's face and tried to find the angle in it, the thing he wanted that this was the preamble to. She found nothing. He was looking at her with a direct, uncomplicated expression. He was not offering her anything except what he had said. "You do not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I do not have to, but I am going to if you will let me, because what happened in there was wrong and I am not particularly good at walking away from wrong things." He paused. "That is a personal failing or a virtue depending on who you ask." Despite everything, something shifted in her expression. The corner of her mouth moved the smallest possible amount towards something that was not quite a smile, but was in the general direction of one. "All right, Mr. Dawson," she said. "Let us go back in." The brass bell announced them again. Gerald Whitmore had resumed his seat and was writing something in a ledger with the unhurried air of a man who had already forgotten the morning's earlier business. The two clerks were at their desks. All three of them looked up when the door opened. Whitmore's expression shifted into something between surprise and irritation when he saw Rebecca. It shifted again, more cautiously, when he registered the man beside her. Frederick Dawson stepped up to the counter with the kind of physical presence that was not aggressive but was undeniable, the way a well-built fence is not threatening but communicates very clearly where the boundary is. He set his hat on the counter, an almost courteous gesture, and looked at Whitmore with an expression that was polite and completely immovable. "Good morning," he said. "My name is Frederick Dawson. I run the Dawson cattle operation southeast of here." "I believe you were just speaking with Miss Keating." Whitmore looked at Rebecca, then back at Frederick. "I was," he said carefully. "Miss Keating has a valid homestead claim," Frederick said. "She has her father's filing receipt dated October 14th, 1877, which establishes the original claim date. She has the county judge's letter from Larned County confirming the filing status. She has the survey notes. Under Section 2 of the Homestead Act of 1862, as amended, immediate family members may inherit and complete a claim in the event of the original filer's death during the filing period. None of the paperwork is deficient. Nothing is missing. I would like you to explain to me precisely what legal basis you have for refusing to process this claim." The room was very quiet. Whitmore opened his mouth and Frederick waited, and the particular quality of that waiting was such that Whitmore seemed to understand that a vague or dismissive answer was not going to work here in the way it had worked before. "The claim period had not begun," Whitmore started. "Which is exactly why the inheritance provision applies," Frederick said. "If the 5-year residency had begun, we would be discussing an entirely different section. Because it had not, we are exactly within the provision Miss Keating cited to you correctly this morning. You know that, sir. I think we both know that." Whitmore looked at his clerks. Neither of them offered anything useful. He looked back at Frederick and then at Rebecca, and the calculation happening behind his eyes was not pleasant to watch, but it was predictable enough. Because Gerald Whitmore was a man who behaved badly when he believed there would be no consequence and adjusted his behavior when he believed otherwise. "There is a processing fee," Whitmore said, which was not a capitulation, but it was the first move in that direction. "How much?" Rebecca asked. $14. Rebecca opened the satchel and counted out $14 in paper notes and placed them on the counter. Whitmore picked up the money. He looked at it. He set it beside the ledger. He was quiet for another moment in the way of a man who is deciding whether he wants to find one more obstacle to place in the path, and Frederick Dawson said nothing at all, just stood at that counter in a way that made very clear he had not misrepresented himself when he said he was not leaving until this was settled. "All right," Whitmore said finally. "Give me the documents." Rebecca placed them on the counter. It took 40 minutes. Gerald Whitmore processed the claim with the minimum possible grace and the maximum possible number of small, petty delays, filling out each form with the slow deliberateness of a man asserting some final residual control over the process, asking questions that did not strictly need answers, finding 2 forms that required a second signature, misplacing a stamp, and taking several minutes to locate it in a drawer he had already opened twice. Through all of it, Frederick Dawson stood at that counter without moving. He did not drum his fingers. He did not shift his weight. He did not offer commentary on the pace of the proceedings. He simply stood there with the quiet, absolute permanence of a man who had nowhere else to be, which was not precisely true, but was a very effective posture. Rebecca stood beside him, and she answered every question Whitmore put to her with perfect precision, and she signed every form where a signature was required, and she held herself with a dignity that cost her something, because it always cost her something to be dignified in the face of indignity, but she did it without breaking. At the end of it, Whitmore stamped the final document and slid it across the counter without a word. Rebecca picked it up. She looked at it. 160 acres in the southern section, adjoining the creek near the Wilson Fork. Her father's name was in the original filing. Her name was now on the transfer and completion. It was done. It was legal. It was hers. She looked up at Frederick. He was watching her, and for a moment neither of them said anything because the moment had a particular weight to it that did not need words placed on top of it. "Thank you," she said to him. Then she looked at Whitmore. "Thank you for your assistance," she said to him, with a formality that contained, if one listened closely, a fine edge of steel. She walked out of the Clearwater Land Office for the second time that morning, and this time the only sound behind her was the brass bell, and it rang clean. Frederick followed her out. They stood together on the sidewalk, and the Dodge City street moved around them with its ordinary morning energy, and Rebecca held the stamped document against her chest and breathed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Yes," she looked at him. "You did not have to do that. I want to be clear that I know that." "I know you know," he said. "You were in there for 40 minutes. "I had nowhere I needed to be for another hour," he said, which was not entirely accurate but felt like the right thing to say. "The fence staples can wait." She looked at him for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved again, and this time it completed the journey to an actual smile. It changed her face considerably. It made her look younger and warmer and like someone who had been keeping something in reserve and had decided to let some of it out. "Can I buy you coffee?" she asked. "It seems like the least I can do." He picked up his hat from where he had left it and put it back on. "I think coffee sounds about right," he said. They went to the Clearwater Hotel dining room, which was the most respectable establishment on the main street and the one place in Dodge City where a woman and a man could sit together at a table in broad daylight without attracting more comment than the situation warranted. The room was busy enough in the late morning to provide a certain anonymous comfort, and they found a table near the window that looked out onto the street. The coffee was strong, which was the only kind either of them wanted. Rebecca ordered it and wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it settle into her palms. "Tell me about the land," Frederick said. She looked at him. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me," he said. "You clearly want it very much. It is worth knowing why." It was a more perceptive thing to say than she had expected, and she took a moment to arrange her answer. "My father came out from Ohio in 1873, she said. "I came with him. We had a farm in the eastern part of the state for the first 2 years, but the land was already claimed up tight and the soil was tired from overworking. He heard about the southern section from a man at a county meeting. Took him a year to save enough to make the move and file. He filed in October, like I said. He was going to build a house in the spring." She paused. "He got sick in November and was gone by December 20th. Frederick was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said, and he said it the way a person says something because they mean it, not as a social formality. "He worked for it," she said. 25 years he worked for land of his own. He got close. I intend to get the rest of the way there." "What will you do with it?" he asked. 160 acres is a lot of land for one person." "Wheat and feed corn," she said. "Possibly a small dairy operation if I can find good stock. My father had a plan laid out. I have been carrying it forward in my head since December." She took a sip of coffee. "What about you?" 14 miles southeast. That is good grazing country." "It is," he said. He told her about his operation, which was a cattle ranch he had built over the past 6 years from a single parcel of government land into something that now ran about 300 head. He had 2 hired hands who worked the operation with him. A Mexican vaquero named Ignacio Reyes who had been with him since the beginning, and a younger man from Tennessee called Holt, who had shown up one winter looking for work, and turned out to be the best natural horseman Frederick had encountered. He talked about the land with the same particular quality of attention that Rebecca had recognized in his listening earlier, a quality that suggested he was talking about something he genuinely cared about rather than performing. They talked for the better part of an hour. Outside the window, Dodge City went about its business, the cattle town that had been rolling in its full rough energy since the Kishom Trail had brought the Longhorn trade north. The sound of it was a constant backdrop, livestock and wagon wheels and the occasional shout from one of the saloons on the other end of the street, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a fiddle that someone was playing in a place Rebecca could not see. When the coffee was finished, she looked at the document on the table between them and felt the reality of it settle into her more fully. "I need to find accommodation tonight," she said. "And tomorrow I need to arrange for supplies and figure out the most practical way to get to the property. I have not actually seen it yet. My father described it to me, but I have never been there." "You have not seen it?" He said this with an expression that contained a complicated mixture of surprise and something else. "No. He filed the claim, and then he fell ill, and then he died, and there was the matter of settling everything in Larned County before I could get here. It has been 4 months. Frederick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is 14 miles from my ranch. I could take you out tomorrow if you wanted to see it. I know that country well. I can tell you which water sources are reliable and where the soil runs good." She looked at him carefully. "That is a very generous offer for someone I have known for less than 2 hours," she said. "It is a practical offer," he said. "You are going to farm land you have never seen. Good information now saves significant problems later, and I know that land." He met her eyes directly. "It is also, I will admit, not entirely without self-interest." "Oh," she said, "the parcel adjoining yours to the east is one I have been watching. I have been thinking about whether to expand. If your southern section is under good management, it affects the water usage at the creek and the grass composition along the boundary. It is in my direct interest to know who is working that land and how." It was a remarkably honest thing to say. The honesty of it, the complete willingness to name his own interest in the matter, sat well with her in a way that was unexpectedly disarming. "All right," she said. "Show me my land, Mr. Dawson. I would like to see it." She stayed that night at the Clearwater Hotel, in a room that cost more than she wanted to spend but less than she had feared. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Dodge City settling into its nighttime character, which was considerably louder and less settled than its daytime one. And she held the stamped document against her chest the way she had held it on the sidewalk outside the land office. And she let herself feel, for the first time since December, something that was adjacent to hope. She was also aware that she was thinking about Frederick Dawson, which was inconvenient, and she acknowledged it with the same directness she applied to everything else. Frederick, for his part, was sleeping under the open Kansas sky at his camp on the edge of town, which was where he always slept when he came to Dodge City, because he found the hotel rooms oppressive, and he had never been able to sleep properly indoors without a window wide open. He lay on his bedroll and looked at the stars, which were extraordinary in the Kansas dark, spread from horizon to horizon with the lavish excess of something that did not know it was supposed to be modest. He thought about Rebecca Keating's face when she had looked down at the stamped document. He thought about the way she had described her father's plan, and then said, with that particular quiet certainty, that she intended to get the rest of the way there. He thought about the land 14 miles from his ranch, and about the fact that he had offered to show it to her before he had entirely thought through what that meant about the direction his mind was taking him. He was not a man who did things without thinking them through. He recognized this as an exception to that pattern, and decided it was probably worth noting. The next morning was clear and brilliant, the kind of Kansas spring morning that makes the previous winter seem like a rumor. Frederick met Rebecca in front of the hotel with 2 horses. his own bay, and a gentle gray he had borrowed from the livery stable for the purpose. Rebecca appeared in practical riding clothes that told him she was not a woman who considered riding a performance, and she looked at the horses with a knowledgeable eye and patted the gray on the nose in a way that immediately reassured the animal. They rode out of Dodge City into the open prairie, and the landscape opened around them the way it does in Kansas, suddenly and completely, the town falling away behind them and the country spreading to every horizon in a vast, grass-rolling expanse that was interrupted by nothing except the occasional stand of cottonwoods along a waterway and the distant forms of cattle grazing in their easy, monumental way. They talked as they rode. The conversation moved easily between them, following no particular agenda, touching on the practical matters of the land, and then drifting to other things. She told him about Ohio, about the farm where she had grown up before she and her father came west, about her mother who had died when Rebecca was 12 of a fever that took 3 people in their community in the same week. He told her about Missouri, about the 40 acres his mother had homesteaded, about learning cattle work from a neighboring rancher who had paid him $2 a month and taught him more in 3 years than most men learned in a decade. He told her about coming to Kansas at 25 with everything he owned in a single pack and a head full of plans, which was a circumstance he had in common with most people in this country at this particular moment in history. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Coming west?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated because the easy answer was obviously no. "There are mornings in February when I am checking fence line in a Kansas blizzard and I regret many specific choices," he said. "But the general direction of it, no. This land is something I cannot describe exactly except that it suits me." "It suits me too," she said, and looked out at the prairie rolling around them. "My father used to say that Ohio was a good land, but it was old in the way of something that had already decided what it was. The West is still deciding." Frederick looked at her sidelong. "That is a very good way to put it," he said. They reached the parcel that had been Thomas Keating's claim around mid-morning. Frederick pointed it out from the top of a low rise, and Rebecca pulled her horse to a stop and looked at it. It was beautiful. There was no other word for it. The land ran south from the rise toward a line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, and the spring grass was a color that was somewhere between gold and green, shifting in the light breeze. The soil along the creek bank was dark and rich, and the creek itself was not wide, but it ran clear and steady, which in Kansas was everything. To the north and east, the land leveled out into broad, flat acres that were exactly what wheat needed, good flat growing ground with sky all the way to the horizon. Rebecca sat on the gray horse and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "He never got to see it." Frederick did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say, and he was wise enough to know it. After a while, she clicked to the horse and rode down the rise, and he followed her, and they spent the morning walking the parcel on horseback and on foot, following the creek line, looking at the soil, discussing the most practical location for a house and a barn based on the water access and the drainage. He showed her where the water table was reliable and where it was seasonal. He showed her the eastern boundary, which was marked by a line of stones that the original surveyor had placed, and which was indeed the boundary that adjoined his own spread. She stood at the boundary stones and looked east at his land and then west at hers and said, "Your cattle have been grazing along this creek." "They have," he said. "The boundary line runs 20 yards north of the creek bed. The grazing has been on the Dawson side of it, but you are going to want a fence here if you are growing crops to keep the stock out." "I am going to want a fence here," she agreed, "and I am going to need help putting one up." "That," he said, "is something I can assist with." She looked at him. "You are remarkably useful for someone I met yesterday," she said. "I have been told I have practical value," he said. She laughed. It was the first full laugh he had heard from her, and it was a good one, genuine and unceremonious, the laugh of a person who laughs when something is actually funny rather than as a social obligation. It changed the whole character of the morning, and Frederick felt something happen in his chest that he recognized as the beginning of a problem, and also as something he was not particularly interested in solving. They ate the noon meal beside the creek, the simple bread and salt pork she had brought from the hotel and the canteen of water he carried, and sat in the shade of the cottonwoods with their horses cropping grass nearby, and the creek making its small, steady sound beside them. "I need to be back in Dodge City by nightfall," she said, "to arrange for materials. I need lumber for framing, seed corn and wheat seed and tools, and I need to find someone to help me build." "There is a good lumber operation in Cimarron," he said. "Better prices than Dodge, and the wood is seasoned properly. 2 days' ride east." "I do not have 2 days," she said. "I need to start breaking ground before June or I lose a growing season." Frederick was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. "I have lumber," he said, "more than I need from a barn expansion I completed last fall. Good seasoned pine. You are welcome to it at cost." Rebecca looked at him. The gray eyes measured him again with that direct, assessing quality. "Why?" she said. "Because it is efficient," he said. "It is sitting in a stack behind my barn. You need it. Transportation savings for us both." And she said because she knew there was something else. He looked at her steadily. "And because I would like a reason to come back out here and see how this land is progressing," he said. "And because I would like a reason to talk to you again." He paused. "I am aware that I am being very direct." "I prefer direct," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. Then she said, "I cannot promise you anything, Mr. Dawson. I have 160 acres to prove up on and 5 years to do it in, and that is going to take every piece of me I have. I'm not in a position to be distracted." "I understand that," he said. "I am not asking for anything that would distract you. I am saying that I would like to be useful to you, and that my motivation is not entirely altruistic, and that I think you deserve to know that." Rebecca picked up a small stone from the creek bank and turned it over in her fingers. She looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. "Come by on Saturday," she said. "I will have made a start on the site by then and we can discuss the lumber." "Saturday," he said. He came by on Saturday. He came by the Saturday after that as well, and the one after that. He brought the lumber, delivered by wagon with Ignacio and Holt's help, and he brought his own tools, and over the course of 3 working weekends in late April and into May, the framing of a small but solid house went up on Rebecca Keating's 160 acres in the southern section, adjoining the creek. It was hard work. It was the kind of work that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only the essential quality of people. Because there is no room for pretense when you are driving nails for 6 hours in the Kansas spring sun. Rebecca worked alongside them without a word of complaint and with a precision that impressed everyone present, because she had watched her father build the farm in Ohio and she had paid attention to every step of it. She knew how to read a level, how to true up a corner post, how to square a window frame. Ignacio, who was a compact and deliberate man in his mid-30s with a dry sense of humor that emerged in small, well-timed doses, declared her the best carpenter on the crew within the first hour, which was both a compliment and a gentle challenge to Holt, who was 22 and easily motivated by competitive feeling. Frederick watched her and worked beside her and spent a considerable amount of time in those weeks trying to be honest with himself about what was happening, because he had always believed that honest self-assessment was the first requirement of good decision-making. What was happening was that he was falling in love with Rebecca Keating. He was falling in love with the way she read the land when she walked it, bending to turn over a clod of soil, and identifying its composition correctly by sight and feel. He was falling in love with the way she argued, which was precisely and with evidence and without anger. He was falling in love with her patience and her stubbornness, and the way she talked about her father, which always told him that she had been loved very well and had loved very well in return. He was falling in love with all of it, the whole complicated architecture of her, and he was doing so with the full awareness that she had told him she could not be distracted, and that he intended to respect that completely. What he had not entirely planned for was the moment in mid-May when the roof framing was nearly complete, and a spring storm rolled in from the northwest, with the sudden violence of Kansas weather in that season. The sky went from blue to an operational gray in about 20 minutes, and the wind came up sharp and smelling of rain, and the roof framing, which was not yet properly braced, began to move in a way that was dangerous. Frederick was up on the frame when the wind hit seriously. He had 3 bracing boards in position and needed a 4th to stabilize the north face before it could shift. He called down for the board, and he expected to hear Holt or Ignacio, but it was Rebecca who came up the ladder with it, moving quickly and without hesitation, holding the 12-foot board vertical and managing it in the wind with a grip that meant business. She got to the top of the ladder and handed him the board and held the other end while he drove the nail, and the wind was working against both of them and the rain had begun, thin and cold and driving sideways, and they were both soaked through in 3 minutes. He drove the last nail and the frame held, and they looked at each other in the rain with 12 feet of framing board between them. And something happened in the space of that look that neither of them attempted to classify, because the storm was still active and the situation demanded attention. They came down off the frame together, and Ignacio and Holt had the tools covered, and the horses moved under the cottonwoods, and the 4 of them waited out the storm in the partial shelter of the framed structure, while the rain came down in sheets, and the lightning drew white lines across the prairie to the south. The storm passed in 40 minutes, the way Kansas storms often do, leaving behind a washed and clarified sky and the smell of wet earth that was one of the better smells in the world. Rebecca pushed wet hair back from her face and looked at the roof framing which was holding. "Good," she said. Frederick looked at her and then looked away, because there was a quality to the moment that was testing the limits of his restraint, and he was fairly certain that his restraint was a thing she had a right to count on. "Good," he agreed. The house was finished in the last week of May. It was not large, but it was solid and well built, with 2 rooms and a front porch and a proper chimney, and Rebecca stood in front of it on the morning they completed it and looked at it with an expression that Frederick thought was one of the finest things he had ever seen on a person's face. It was not quite happiness, or not only happiness. It was the expression of a person who has accomplished something that cost them something real, and is registering both the cost and the accomplishment at the same time. She moved in the next day. She had her father's few pieces of furniture transported from the storage facility in Dodge City where she had been keeping them, his solid oak table and 2 chairs, and the iron bedstead that had come west from Ohio in the back of a wagon, and she arranged them in the new house and built a fire in the new fireplace for the first time, more for the ceremony of it than because the May night required it. The land was broken and seeded through June. She had hired a young man from Dodge City named Samuel, who was 16 and strong and willing to learn, and she worked beside him every day with the breaking plow, opening the soil in long, clean furrows, the work of it slow and physical and deeply satisfying in the way that only foundational work can be. The wheat went in first, then the feed corn, and by the end of June the first green threads of wheat were showing above the dark soil, and Rebecca Keating stood at the edge of her field in the long evening light and felt her father's plan becoming a real thing in the world. Frederick came by twice a week, in the early mornings before his own work demanded him, or in the evenings when the day's labor was done. The visits had ceased to be about the house or the fence or the lumber. They had become what they actually were, which was 2 people who could not quite stop finding reasons to be in each other's presence, and who were both being very careful about what they said about that. On a Thursday evening in late June, he came by when the wheat was showing well, and the evening was one of those Kansas summer evenings that seems to have been designed specifically to make the world look its best, with a warm gold light spreading from the west and the cottonwoods along the creek heavy and green, and moving slightly in a soft breeze. They sat on the front porch, which had 2 chairs on it because Rebecca had put 2 chairs on it from the beginning, which she had not consciously planned but also had not been accidental. They sat with tin cups of coffee and the evening around them, and the conversation had been easy and unhurried, ranging from the wheat growth to a piece of news from Dodge City about a land dispute between 2 of the larger ranchers to the north, and then to nothing in particular, which was sometimes the best kind of conversation. In the quiet that followed a lull in the talking, Frederick said, "I need to say something." Rebecca looked at him over her coffee. "Then say it," she said. "I told you in April that I was not asking for anything that would distract you," he said. "I meant that then. I still mean it. I am not going to ask for anything you cannot give, and I am not going to make the work harder." He paused. "But I would be dishonest if I let this continue without telling you that I care about you considerably more than a neighboring rancher has a logical basis for caring about a neighboring farmer." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. The evening moved around them, the cottonwoods and the wheat and the creek sound. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I have known for a while," she said. "I have also been trying to be honest with myself about my own situation." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I am not a woman who does things halfway. If I let myself care about you, which I believe I have already begun to do whether I intended to or not, I am going to care about you completely. And that is frightening to me because I have lost people I cared about completely, and the cost of that is one I know very precisely." "I know," he said. "I have lost people too." "I know you have," she said. She had learned, over the weeks of their conversations, that he had lost his mother 3 years ago, which was why the 40-acre Missouri homestead had been sold to a neighbor, and that the money from that sale had been most of what he had used to start his own operation in Kansas. She knew that he did not talk about his mother often, but that when he did, the quality of what he said told her everything about the kind of person she had been and the kind of son he had been in return. "I am not asking you to not be frightened," he said. "I am asking whether, given that you are frightened and I am telling you clearly what I am feeling, there is anything here that you want to do something about." She looked at him for a long time. The evening light was full on his face, and it was a good face, she thought, not beautiful in any conventional sense but entirely honest in its architecture, a face that showed you what was inside it rather than hiding it. "Yes," she said. "There is something here I want to do something about." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and found her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the evening while the light went slowly from gold to rose to the deep luminous blue of the Kansas summer dark. The summer deepened, and the wheat grew, and the 2 of them made their way toward each other with the same deliberate, unrushed quality that Frederick applied to everything important and Rebecca applied to everything. He was at her farm on most of the days when his own work allowed, and she rode over to his spread on the days when her work allowed, and they learned each other with the kind of attention that is only possible when 2 people are both genuinely interested in what they find. She learned that he read widely, which surprised her because he kept his books in a wooden crate under his bed as though slightly embarrassed by them, and she made him bring the crate out to the shelf she helped him build in the main room of his house, and they argued pleasantly about the relative merits of his various volumes. He learned that she was a remarkable practical mathematician, that she could calculate the yield projections for her fields in her head faster than he could do it on paper, and that this skill extended to an ability to read and manage money with a precision that made her the best financial mind he had encountered since a banker in Wichita whose opinion he had always respected. They had their first real disagreement in August over the question of the fence line. Frederick had proposed running the boundary fence 2 feet onto his side of the survey line as a practical buffer, and Rebecca had objected strenuously on the grounds that a fence on the wrong side of a survey line was legally problematic regardless of the intent behind it, and they had stood at the line of survey stones and argued about it for 20 minutes with the full energy of two people who both believed they were right and were not inclined to pretend otherwise. Frederick had eventually conceded that she was correct, which he did with good grace and without resentment, and Rebecca had thanked him for conceding with equal good grace, and they had then built the fence on the correct side of the line together, which took another 4 hours and ended with both of them sunburned and satisfied. On an evening in late August, he kissed her for the first time. They were standing at the creek at the end of a long working day, washing the dust and labor from their hands and faces, and she turned from the water and he was very close, and the day was settling into evening around them with all its particular softness, and he looked at her with a question in his face, and she answered it, and it was a good first kiss, unhurried and honest, and it tasted like the end of the summer and the beginning of something else. They were married in October of 1878, 6 months after Rebecca had walked into the Clearwater Land office alone and walked out with Frederick Dawson beside her and a stamped deed in her hand. The wedding took place on her land, in front of the house they had built, with the wheat already harvested and the fields lying gold and stubble golden in the October light. The minister came out from Dodge City, a plain-spoken man named Reverend Alcott, who performed the ceremony without excessive flourish, which was exactly what both of them wanted. Ignacio and Holt were there, and Samuel, who had continued working for Rebecca through the growing season and had proven to be both capable and loyal. 3 women from the homesteading community in the southern section came with their families, women Rebecca had met over the summer through the particular network of female solidarity that formed among homesteaders because they needed each other and knew it. Gerald Whitmore was not invited, which went without saying. The ceremony was simple, and the words they said to each other were the standard words of the time, but they said them with a sincerity that made Ignacio, who was not a sentimental man, look away at the horizon for a moment as though checking the weather. After the ceremony, there was a meal on long tables set up in front of the house, and a fiddle player someone had brought from Dodge City, and dancing on the flat ground near the creek in the October evening. Frederick danced with Rebecca with the focused intensity of a man who did not consider dancing his strongest skill, but was absolutely determined to give it his best effort. And Rebecca laughed at his expression and told him he was doing fine, and he told her that her assessment was either accurate or generous, and that either way he was grateful for it. They spent their first winter as a married couple navigating the particular complexity of 2 independent people making a shared life. They were not always easy with each other. The winter was long and the Kansas cold was serious business, and being confined to close quarters tested the different rhythms of 2 people who had each been on their own. Frederick was accustomed to a particular kind of morning quiet that Rebecca's habit of talking through her plans aloud at the breakfast table disrupted, and Rebecca was not accustomed to someone else having opinions about how her farming operation should be structured, even when those opinions were reasonable. They worked through it the way they worked through everything, by talking about it directly, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always productive. He told her about the morning quiet, and she started keeping her planning conversations for after the second cup of coffee. She told him that the farm was her operation, and that she valued his input but needed to make the decisions herself, and he said that was exactly as it should be and meant it, and kept his counsel to occasions when she asked for it, which she did with increasing frequency as the winter wore on and the questions became more complex. The farm was prospering. The first wheat harvest in the fall of 1878 had been good, better than she had projected, and the feed corn had sold at a fair price to 2 of the cattle operations in the surrounding area, including Frederick's, which he paid for at the market rate without any discount that would have been a kind of condescension dressed as generosity. She put the income back into the operation, buying seed for the expanded planting she had planned for 1879, and investing in a better breaking plow that Ignacio helped her identify at a farm equipment sale in Cimarron. In the spring of 1879, Rebecca told Frederick that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Tuesday morning in March when the world outside was still winter, but the light had the particular quality that announces the coming season. And she told him in the practical, direct way she told him most things, with the additional information that she had confirmed it with the doctor in Dodge City, and that she planned to continue working through the planting season as long as she was able. Frederick was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if he was going to say something concerning, and then he stood up from the breakfast table and came around to her side and held her face in his hands carefully, as though she was something that had been given to him unexpectedly and was more than he had known how to hope for. "Rebecca," he said, and did not say anything else for a moment because there was apparently nothing else immediately available. "Frederick," she said. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You know that. I am a person who is currently planning a planting schedule and incidentally having a child," she said, but she was smiling. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said, which was also the most romantically earnest thing he had ever said aloud, and it cost him something because he was not by nature a man who made large declarations, and she received it with the gravity it deserved. She kissed him. "I know about the books under the bed," she said. "Those are gone," he said. "They have been on the shelf for months." "I know," she said. "That is what I am talking about." The child was born in November of 1879, a son, and they named him Thomas Frederick Dawson, Thomas for Rebecca's father and Frederick for his. He was born in the house that Frederick had helped build on Thomas Keating's 160 acres, delivered by a capable midwife named Mrs. Alvarez, who had delivered most of the children in the southern section for the past 4 years, and who had, in her time, seen both the best and worst circumstances of that work, and brought to each one a competence and steadiness that Rebecca deeply respected. Thomas was a solid, round-faced baby with Frederick's dark hair and Rebecca's gray eyes, and he seemed from the first day of his existence to be working at the problem of the world, with a concentrated, determined expression that both his parents found extremely familiar. Frederick held him on the first evening of his life with the particular helplessness that large, competent men often experience when confronted with infants, which is the helplessness of having no applicable skill for the situation, and Rebecca watched him figure it out and felt a love so large it was almost frightening. The years that followed were full, not in the way of being cluttered, but in the way of being substantive, filled with things that mattered. The farm grew. By 1881, Rebecca had expanded the wheat planting to fill the full productive acreage of the parcel, and she had added a small dairy operation with 4 cows that supplied milk to several families in the area, and a modest but reliable additional income. Frederick's cattle operation had grown as well, and they had worked out a practical arrangement whereby the Dawson cattle could graze on a portion of the eastern section of Rebecca's land in exchange for a fence maintenance agreement that benefited both operations. The homesteading community around them grew and changed. New families arrived, and some of the older claims were proved up and sold, and new ones filed. The land office in Dodge City was under different management by 1880, because Gerald Whitmore had been quietly removed from his position following a formal complaint from the county judge about a pattern of processing irregularities that had affected multiple claimants over several years. Rebecca had heard this news from Frederick, who had heard it in Dodge City on a supply run, and she had received it without satisfaction, but without pretending she felt none, which would have been dishonest. "It should have been done sooner," she said. "Yes," Frederick said. "There are other women who came to him before me who did not have someone to walk back in with them," she said. "Yes," Frederick said again. "That is true, and that is wrong." She looked at him. "It is the particular wrong of this time," she said quietly. "There are so many women out here building and farming and proving land, and the law is written to allow it, and then there are men like Whitmore who find ways to sit in the middle of the law and use it as a wall instead of a door." She paused. "I was fortunate that you were there that morning." "You would have found a way without me," he said. "Probably," she said. eventually. But I am glad I did not have to. She looked at him with that direct gray gaze. I am very glad you walked back in with me. He took her hand. So am I, he said. In 1882, their second child arrived. This time it was a daughter, born in May with the particular good timing of a baby who arrives when the spring work is at a brief lull, and the weather is warm, and the world is as hospitable as Kansas ever gets. They named her Clara Jane Dawson, Clara for Frederick's mother and Jane because Rebecca had always liked the name. She was quieter than Thomas from the beginning, with an observational quality that manifested as very large eyes that took in everything around her with great seriousness. Thomas, who was 2.5 and deeply committed to his own perspective on all things, regarded his sister with initial suspicion that gave way over the course of several weeks to a proprietary protectiveness that was both endearing and slightly exhausting. By the spring of 1883, the Keating-Dawson farm had a full 5 years of operation behind it, which meant that the original homestead claim was ready for final proof. Under the Homestead Act, 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation were required before the land could be fully patted over to the claimant. Rebecca filed the final proof application herself, riding into Dodge City on a clear April morning with her documentation, which was now a thick and impressively organized file of receipts and records and witness statements that covered every year of cultivation and residency. She went to the land office alone. Frederick had offered to come with her, and she had thought about it, and she had said, "I would like to go by myself this time." He had understood immediately, which was one of the things she loved most about him. The land office had a new clerk behind the counter, a young man named Paul who was perhaps 23 and who looked up at her with professional courtesy and processed her application with complete competence and no drama whatsoever. It took 30 minutes. He stamped the final proof certificate, dated it, and slid it across the counter with a pleasant, businesslike manner. "Congratulations, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "The land is yours." She looked down at the certificate. 160 acres in the southern section, adjoining the creek near the Wilson Fork. Full title, proved, hers. She thought about her father standing at the land office counter in October of 1877 with his filing receipt. She thought about the morning she had stood on the sidewalk outside this building, with laughter coming through the door. She thought about Frederick Dawson setting his hat on the counter and saying, with complete and quiet certainty, "I would like you to explain to me precisely what legal basis you have." She folded the certificate carefully and put it in the leather satchel that had belonged to her father, which she still carried because she had never found a reason to replace it. "Thank you," she said to the young man behind the counter. She rode home through the April morning with the certificate in the satchel and the spring country spread around her, the Kansas land that was still deciding what it was going to be, and she felt the full weight and the full rightness of everything she had built on it. The wheat fields and the dairy cows, and the solid house with the front porch that had 2 chairs on it, and a small boy who called her Mama, and a small girl who was currently learning to walk with the serious determination of someone who considers falling to be a problem to be solved, rather than an obstacle to despair over. She came over the rise above the farm and saw it below her in the spring light, the fields showing the first green of the new growing season, the cattle barn that Frederick and Ignacio and Holt and she had built together the previous autumn, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still morning air. Frederick was in the near pasture on his bay horse, moving along the fence line with the easy, competent manner she had watched him work with for 5 years, and had never stopped being glad to see. He spotted her on the rise and raised one hand. She raised one hand in return and rode down to meet him. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He looked at her face, and everything he needed to know was in it. He reached across the space between their horses and held her hand for a moment, and the spring light was on the fields around them, and the land was entirely hers and also entirely theirs. "Your father would be proud," he said. "He would," she said. I think he would also have liked you a great deal." "I hope so," Frederick said. "He liked plain speaking and practical men," she said. "He would have liked you." They rode back to the house together through the spring morning, and Thomas, who had been watching from the porch with his characteristic concentrated expression, came running down to meet them with the short-legged urgency of a 3-year-old who cannot yet modulate between walking and running, and so defaults to running at all times. Frederick swung down from his horse and picked him up mid-stride and tossed him up with practiced ease, and Thomas shouted with the pure joy of it. And Rebecca came off her horse and went into the house where Clara was awake in her crib and reached down and lifted her daughter, who regarded her with those large, serious eyes, and then smiled in the sudden, total way that infants smile, completely and without reservation. The years continued to move. The wheat harvests were good more often than they were difficult, and the difficult years were navigated with the particular resourcefulness of people who had planned for them. Frederick's cattle operation expanded the year. He and Ignacio identified a contract with the rail stockyards in Wichita that gave them a reliable market and a fair price, and the additional income from that contract allowed them to hire 2 additional hands and to make improvements to the Dawson property that had been delayed for several seasons. Thomas grew with the relentless efficiency of a healthy child, moving from round-faced baby to determined toddler to a sturdy and energetic boy who had his father's calm and his mother's absolute precision, and who showed, by the time he was 6, a deep and practical interest in the workings of the farm that was not the performance of a child seeking approval, but something genuine and inherent. He followed Rebecca across the fields asking questions about the soil composition and the planting depths with a seriousness that made Ignacio declare him a natural farmer, which was the highest compliment Ignacio offered on any subject. Clara, who was 2.5 years younger, was her brother's opposite in temperament and his equal in determination. Where Thomas worked outward, making sense of the world through its physical properties and practical mechanisms, Clara worked inward, through people, reading faces and relationships with an accuracy that was sometimes startling. She had Frederick's quality of genuine attention and Rebecca's directness, and by the time she was 4, she was conducting conversations with visiting adults as though she was genuinely interested in their answers, which she was. In the winter of 1884, Holt, who had been Frederick's hired hand since those early years of the operation, announced that he had saved enough to file his own homestead claim to the north, a parcel of good grazed land that he had been watching for 2 seasons. Frederick released him from his employment with genuine goodwill and the best possible reference, and Ignacio and the 2 newer hands absorbed the work without difficulty. They hired a young woman named Alyssa, who was 18 and had come west from Missouri with her family and was looking for reliable work, to help Rebecca with the dairy operation and the domestic management of the farmhouse, which had by this point become a household full enough to warrant additional hands. Alyssa was hardworking and quick-minded and became, over the following year, genuinely indispensable both to the operation and to Rebecca personally, which was a quality Rebecca recognized and rewarded with fair wages and genuine respect, because she knew precisely what it was to come to a place new and unfamiliar and make yourself necessary through the force of your own capability. By 1885, the farm was something that Thomas Keating, had he lived to see it, would have looked at with a full heart. The original 160 acres were under productive cultivation. The house had been expanded by a second room to accommodate the growing family. The dairy operation supported 12 cows. The wheat fields were a consistent producer, and the boundary fence that Rebecca and Frederick had argued about and then built together was solid and well-maintained, and served the purposes of both operations without conflict. The spring of 1886 brought another child, a boy they named James, who arrived in March with the easy efficiency of a 3rd child, and immediately set about establishing his own particular character, which turned out to involve a sunny disposition and a talent for making everyone around him feel unreasonably cheerful. Thomas, who was 6, received his new brother with the magnanimous generosity of a child, who already considered himself the senior authority on most matters. And Clara, who was 4, immediately began treating James as a project, which he accepted with the complete equanimity of an infant who has no basis for comparison. That summer, on an evening when the wheat was green and tall, and the Kansas sky was doing everything it was capable of doing with color and scale, Frederick and Rebecca sat on the front porch of the house he had helped her build, as they had sat on hundreds of evenings, with coffee and the day behind them, and the country spread around them in the long light. Thomas was inside with Alyssa, working on the letters and numbers that Rebecca taught him in the evenings, because she intended her children to be educated, and she was doing it herself until a school could be established in the community, which she was also working on. Clara was asleep. James was asleep. The cottonwoods along the creek were moving in the evening breeze. The wheat was doing exactly what wheat is supposed to do. "What are you thinking about?" Frederick asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. She turned the coffee cup in her hands and looked out at the fields. "I was thinking about a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, she said. "I was thinking about the fact that on that morning I was standing on a sidewalk in Dodge City with laughter coming through a door, and now I am sitting on a porch in front of a house I built with 160 acres of good wheat land in front of me and 2 sleeping children inside, and a third one learning his letters." He looked at her. The evening light was on her face, and she was 34 years old now, and she had been described, by people who knew her, in terms that were consistently and specifically about what she had done, and what she was rather than how she looked, which was exactly what she had always wanted. She was also, in Frederick's considered opinion, more beautiful than she had ever been, with the particular beauty of a person who has been doing exactly what they were made to do for long enough that it has become visible in everything about them. "What would you have said to that woman on that sidewalk?" he asked. "If you could." She thought about it. "I would have said that the next person who comes out that door is going to walk back in with you," she said. "And I would have said that before this is done, you are going to be standing on your own land looking at your own wheat growing, and you are going to be loved in ways you have not yet learned to imagine." Frederick set down his coffee and reached for her hand, and she gave it to him, and they sat in the evening that was the accumulated result of everything they had done, and everything they had built, and everything they had chosen. And the land around them was the kind of thing a person can look at when they know, with complete and quiet certainty, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Thomas's voice came from inside the house, calling for his mother to check his letter work, and James made a small sound that was not quite crying, but was a preliminary inquiry into whether crying might be warranted, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening air, and the Kansas sky went through its daily last performance of color before the dark, and Rebecca Keating Dawson looked at all of it and felt, in the full and completed sense of the word, that she was home. She squeezed Frederick's hand and stood up. She went inside to check on Thomas's letters and to reassure James that the world was still proceeding in an acceptable manner, and Frederick sat on the porch for a moment longer, looking out at the wheat fields that had been nothing but unbroken prairie 8 years ago, listening to the sound of his wife's voice through the open door of the house he had helped her build, talking to their son with the patient, precise manner she brought to everything she cared about. He thought about that April morning when he had walked out of a hardware store with a box of fence staples and seen a woman standing very still on a sidewalk with laughter coming through a door behind her, and had walked over without entirely deciding to. He thought about the brass bell of the land office ringing when they went back in together. He thought about standing at that counter with the complete and absolute certainty that he was not going to move until it was settled. He had not known on that morning what he was beginning. He knew now with the thorough and evidence-based knowledge of a man who had spent 8 years paying close attention to the best thing that had ever happened to him, exactly what it had been. He picked up his coffee and looked at the evening sky, which was doing something extraordinary over the Kansas horizon, and he smiled to himself in the private, unperformed way of a person who is not smiling for anyone but the truth of what they know. Then he got up from the porch chair and went inside to his family, to his life, to the woman who had built all of it with her own remarkable hands and her absolute refusal to accept the wrong thing lying down. And the door closed behind him on a perfect June evening in Kansas, and the wheat moved gently in the warm western breeze, and the creek made its small, steady sound in the dark, and on 160 acres of good Kansas earth. Everything was exactly and completely and finally and fully settled.